I've built an entire career off of solving problems that people face with technology with cool teams of people, right? Like if you look at my resume, that's what I've done. And I've done it in healthcare, education, e-commerce, government security, all sorts of different places. And when I get presented with a problem that feels super meaty and that feels like I have a distinct way of looking at it that nobody else has looked at it before, those are always itches that I try to scratch, like paths I try to follow.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready?
Today's guest is Leslie Newell, a former tech executive turned entrepreneur who helps corporate parents transform their home lives using proven business strategies. After leading product teams at companies like Slack, Wayfair, Craftsy, and Artifact Uprising, Leslie discovered that the same principles that make tech products successful, user-centered design, agile methodologies, and systems thinking, could revolutionize how busy professionals manage their homes. She's the founder of Bright Violet Home, where she combines her 14 years of product leadership experience with behavioral science to help working parents create sustainable home systems that actually stick. A graduate of Olin College of Engineering and mother of 2 kids under 5, Leslie brings a unique perspective on bridging the gap between corporate excellence and home life mastery. Welcome to the show, Leslie.
Oh, thanks so much for the intro, Heather. I'm so excited to be here.
I think this is going to be such a fun conversation. First of all, you and I have a lot of similarities in our backgrounds and the way we think, probably because of our backgrounds, but there's just so much synergy. And I love what you're doing right now, where you're taking the things that make people successful in their work lives and you're helping them apply it to their home lives. And it's so interesting to me because I do something kind of similar in my own coaching practice where I often help people realize like you have certain skill sets that can be applied to different things in the workplace. And so a lot of times it's more like things like, someone might be a great product manager. And so maybe they approach a situation with a colleague or their boss, as a project. And all of a sudden it gives it like a new framework and new ways of like thinking about how to be successful. So, a scenario that feels maybe unmanageable starts to feel very manageable when you can apply skill sets that you already have. And so that's what you're doing, except you're taking sort of our professional successes and then you're helping apply them to making our home lives more successful. So super interesting stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And you really put a good emphasis on how I think about things. I've always been a really strengths-based leader. You can sit there and really beat yourself up all day long about the things that you're not capable of right now or that you're still learning. But when you come at it from an area where you can apply those strengths, whatever they are, because all of us have unique strengths, being able to solve new and interesting problems with those strengths first, and then kind of working on your weaknesses, your growing edges while you're learning something new is the piece that really unlocks that zone of genius that so many of us have and so many of us are still trying to figure out. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Aren't we all? Now, you just mentioned, Leslie, you talked about leadership. And so last year, you and I, with a few other professionals, got together and we gave a panel at Denver Startup Week called Why Won't They Just Do Their Jobs? And of course, this panel was really, the main takeaway was all about trust and empathy. And so I thought we'd actually start there and talk a little bit about leadership and trust and empathy because we both have backgrounds in the tech space and leadership experience. And of course, we were on the panel together. So it just seemed like a really great place to start our conversation. And what I'd really like to talk about is the role you think that workplace culture plays in ultimately shaping how individuals perceive or perform as managers versus leaders, and what's been your personal experience. So that whole am I a manager or am I a leader?
Yeah. There's a lot of meat there. I would say my personal experience in tech is so interesting because oftentimes in tech, you have pretty aggressive growth targets, right? So almost all of the companies that I've been in set goals that they're like, we want to grow 30%, 40%, 50%. And what is the blessing and the curse of that mindset is that when you're trying to grow, 30, 40, 50% year over year, you have these exciting challenges that allow people to grow and be empowered and run fast and learn a lot. But you can also lead to a lot of fear-based decision making when the growth isn't coming as easy as you might think. And so one of the really big pillars of my leadership style and my management style is really coming from this place of empowerment. The best managers and the best leaders that I've ever worked with come from this sense that we have big, hairy, scary goals. And even if we don't meet them, our ability to fix whatever problems we encounter as we go on this big, hairy, scary journey is immeasurable. There's no problem that we can't fix. And so it creates this really safe environment for people to think big, make mistakes, try new things. Some of the places that I've been that haven't had that mindset, where it's comes from fear first, we have to prevent a bad outcome, have been harder to work in. And it's more difficult to kind of try new things because you're trying so hard to prevent bad outcomes. And so really that basis of empowerment is something that's super important to me and my leadership style. And it's something that I try to bring to the companies and the people that I work with.
Something you just said there, Leslie, you were talking about these like sort of two ideologies. And what I just want to point out, if people didn't catch it, is like the first one, while there was this big, hairy, scary objective, it was really more about the journey getting there. And in the second scenario, it was much more about the product, the outcome, the end goal. And, I work in another space as well where we talk a lot about studio thinking, which has a lot of similarities with design thinking. But if you think about both of those concepts, they are about the process of getting there, not so much about the end result. Like the end result is sort of the outcome of the journey. And while you want to keep your eye on the prize, so to speak, you have to have intentionality and focus on the process that like gets you there. And I think that is probably really the big difference between, option A versus like option B, where option B is all about just like, let's avoid the bad thing from happening. It also reminds me about like people who get in sort of like scarcity mindset, right? And so when you kind of fall into those same traps, you're more focused on some kind of endpoint than you are about what's like going to happen between where you are and that place in the future. So I don't know, just some like interesting little things that I caught there. So that's really interesting. Now, what's been your experience as a leader, Leslie? You talked about being someone who's really focused on strengths, and I'm sure some of that leadership has sort of tipped over into your entrepreneurial journey, and we'll get there, but I just want to hear a little bit more about your experience in like leadership.
Yeah. I fell into true people management kind of accidentally. I joined a company, gosh, this is going on 5 or 6 years ago, where I was hired as an individual contributor. I was doing my thing. I felt really in my zone of genius. I felt really competent. And then 2.5 months after, a good chunk of the leadership around me left. And so I kind of found myself in this wonderful opportunity where I was able to step into a leadership role. I was promoted to director. I was managing a team of 4 or 5 people, depending on the time. And my first go at people management had its pluses and minuses. I shared the story in the Denver Startup Week talk around, an early management experience that I had where I had joined a company where our goal was to grow a subscription-based video service to 150,000 subscribers in a year. When I joined, we had 150. And no, that's not me misspeaking. So we had less than 1% of what we needed. And there were all sorts of stories that leadership told us around why that was super achievable, but it was still a big goal to reach for. I came into that challenge thinking that the skills that I had learned as an IC were the skills that I would need to lead a team towards that big, hairy, scary goal. So what did I do? I sat down with my team and I said, here are the 40 to 50 different tests that we should run. And hey, team, go do those things. And then, the team would go do some things and they would come back and, as typical in tech, very few of the A/B tests that you run actually yield a positive result. You have to try a bunch of things. And so we weren't growing. We weren't yielding those results that we really wanted. But more than that, what started to concern me was my team felt really combative, really angsty, for lack of a better term. And finally, it hit a head where one of my team members, I was kind of talking about the pieces that we needed to improve in one of our one-on-ones. And he made what felt at the moment like an offhanded comment of, well, I don't even know what we're doing here. And that stopped me in my tracks because as a leader, I had a philosophical belief that if my team doesn't understand what they're doing here, then they can't make any improvement in what we're trying to do. And I was leading in a very different way. So that was a moment for me to say, okay, tell me more. And in hindsight, I'm really proud of myself for not shutting down in that moment, because when a team member is like, I don't even know what we're doing here, that could have been a huge, well, I'm just going to, of course, you know what you're doing here. And of course, kind of put it back on this person. And really what they explained to me was that they knew the number, they knew the 150 to 150,000, but they didn't know what experience we were trying to create, the vision of what we were trying to create for those people that would cause that growth, right? So when you start with a number, you can kind of work your way into a lot of different stories that you could grow that number. And I was coming at it from a very detail-oriented, if you just do the right tests, then, you'll make things happen. So what I did was I took the team off-site for a day. We kind of worked through what is the vision that we're working towards? What is the mission we're trying to work towards? Who are we designing for? What are the pieces that are really important to this person that would make them sign up for a service like ours? And spoiler alert, we never came close to that 150,000 number, but we got a heck of a lot closer than we would have had I not paused and said, I'm not going to dictate or control or scrutinize what my team is doing. I'm going to really kind of lead them to a place where they're trusted, empowered to make a lot of those ideas happen themselves. And my job as a leader becomes less around being the idea generator and more about being the person who can unblock them from progress and be able to monitor on a daily basis, are we going closer or farther, and be that course corrector.
Yeah, one of the things I just want to zoom in on a little bit, Leslie, is you talked about that sort of first transition from not being a people leader to being a people leader, and how you sort of just assumed that the skills that you had would be the right ones for this new position. And the reason I want to zoom in is because I think that happens to so many people, right? There's a saying, what got you here won't get you there. And so, yes, our hard work and our subject matter expertise and whatever transferable skills we have do take us so far. But then when we level up, we sometimes don't realize that now we need some new skills. And so one of the reasons continuous learning is one of my values is because I just recognize the fact that there's always more, right? I'm just a naturally curious person, but there's always more, right? There's always more you can do. There's sometimes skills that you need. And the reality is our workplaces these days, most of them don't do a lot to help you make that transition from individual contributor to people leader, people manager. And so what I love about your story though, Leslie, is you realized pretty quickly that something else needed to happen. And so good on you. Cause I sort of imagine people who would kind of take more of the approach where it's well, I've come this far, I just have to keep charging ahead. And instead you were just pause, reflect, recalibrate, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And you said it so much better than I could. One of the beliefs that I have is that almost anybody can be trained for any job, which is a very almost controversial opinion in, the days where you look at job descriptions and they've got, 16 required qualifications and, I could go down that path all day long. But one of the things that I've found over and over is that you can't teach growth mindset. You can cultivate it. You can bring it out of a person who has been, for whatever circumstances, put in situations where they've adapted to a little bit more of a fixed mindset. You can create the environment that allows that growth mindset to happen. But if somebody truly believes that their way is the best way, that's a much harder thing to coach for. And it's something that I think is such an interesting leadership conundrum, is how do you create those environments? And also, how do you create environments where you can have clear expectations such that if you do have to make a hard, pivot towards, parting ways with somebody, how do you do that knowing that you're making the right decision for your team and for your company?
Oh gosh, I feel like we could have a whole podcast episode just about that, Leslie.
Yeah. Lots of sound bites here.
I am going to pivot here really quick because I think that what I'd like to understand is at some point you decided to take a break from tech, right? So there's some sort of turning point in your career where you realize, hey, it's time for something entirely new. And so what did that transition look like? What did that pivot look like? What caused you to sort of seek out a new journey?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that question because so many of these sorts of life changes can feel like an overnight decision. But the decision to kind of try something new and take a break was actually 10 years in the making. My husband and I are big planners. And so I knew I come from an entrepreneurial family. My parents own their own small business. And there was always something about that made me say, I want to try that one day. And so when my husband and I got married, we were combining finances, and one of the funds, the saving funds that we created was the Leslie Starts a Business Fund. And so, just automating a portion of our paychecks into that week over week to really make sure that I could have the space to make that dream happen, to take a sabbatical, to try something completely different. I have previously tried to start businesses on the side while being in tech, and for this life stages that I was in, it was really challenging for me. I am in things 150% or not in them at all. And so juggling my own enterprise with tech was really challenging. And so, fast forward to 2024, I had spent 3 years at a really amazing opportunity. I got an opportunity to join an executive team as their VP of product and really learned how to be a product leader there. So much good insight and opportunity and no shortage of problems to solve, and many leaders who really kind of supported me in that empowered way that I had talked about of, whatever decisions you make, we can unwind it. I'm behind you 100%. We can fix whatever comes up. And then, as I went forward, I started to realize like I could kind of hit a ceiling. I was 36 years old and I was like, okay, I'm a VP of product on an executive team. I hit that goal that had been my goal since I started my career 14 years ago. And I had a decision of, do I stay? Do I go to another product leadership job? Or is this the time to take some time off? And I was feeling like this was the right time to take some time off. So, my kids are young. I had lots of different opportunities, but I think the interesting part of that, it was more a felt sense in the end. I'm very analytical and very like, okay, show me how the data works, show me how the math works, show me why this time in my life is the perfect time to take a career break. And in the end, after thinking about it and talking about it for hours, days, probably weeks with my husband and with other people that I trusted, that I reached that point that was a felt sense of like, yep, this is the right time. And I made the leap. And that was really scary for someone like me.
There's something familiar about the feeling of like hitting a ceiling. And so honestly, most of my career shifts have been significant career shifts. So what I'm talking about is like actually leaving a company to go to another company. Those have often been about hitting some kind of ceiling, right? And so just recognizing that there's not really anywhere else to go. And also there's not really necessarily any more ways to grow. So, I mean, it's important to be both, right? Like, it's not always about upward corporate mobility, right? It's not always about climbing the corporate ladder, but to some degree it is, right? So it's like, the farther up you go, the less positions that there are. And there are places that you go and there are no more positions above you except the position above you. So, I mean, like, that's like one scenario. And then from a growth perspective, I've been in positions where a year before I left, I realized like, hey, I'm sitting at the ceiling. I don't want the jobs above me. I don't want the jobs adjacent to me. So where do I go from here? And that's where you realize that you're kind of what is that saying? I'm a big fish in a small pond. When you get to that point, you're like, okay, I'm in a small pond. I need a bigger pond if I'm going to keep growing, whether that be upward mobility, just growth in general, new skills, that kind of thing. So I think that there's a strong familiarity. I resonate a lot with the idea of hitting that ceiling, and I'm sure other people do too, right? Like lots of people get to a place. And so what I think is important for people to recognize though is sometimes those ceilings happen and you could still be in like mid-level management, right? Like when you look around, if there's no place to move, whether that be upward or like, parallel to where you are, if there's no place to move, you've hit a ceiling, and so then you have to start asking yourself some hard questions like, are you comfortable here? And if you are, that's great. Like there's no criticism. You just have to be able to recognize the situation that you're in and understand what trade-offs you're making. But then on the other hand, if you're like, well, I want more for myself than what I have right now, then you have to either be willing to go out and find it, or you have to be willing to go out and create it. And so creating it is what you did. And so what I'm really interested though is you come from this tech background, you're making products, right, in the tech space. And then you come to this entrepreneurial journey and you're like, I'm going to help busy parents. And so what I want to understand is what was it about the challenges of parenting and the challenges that parents face that ultimately that's where you decided to start your business and like really helping them sort of focus on managing their homes and their mental loads. Like how does that happen? Because they seem like disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah, I love everything that you just ran through there because it actually in the moment gave me clarity on what was the ceiling that I hit. And the ceiling that I hit was I've built an entire career off of solving problems that people face with technology with cool teams of people, right? Like if you look at my resume, that's what I've done. And I've done it in healthcare, education, e-commerce, government security, all sorts of different places. And when I get presented with a problem that feels super meaty and that feels like I have a distinct way of looking at it that nobody else has looked at it before, those are always itches that I try to scratch, like paths I try to follow. And so to go back to your original question, I'm a mom. So I'm a mom of 2 kids. They're almost 5 and almost 2. And I have a wonderful, loving husband who is amazing. And we're a dual working parent family trying to raise 2 small children. And we actually come from very different familial backgrounds, such that we had to, when we started dating and when we got more serious and moved in together and got married, we had to have a really intentional way of looking at how we wanted to be together as partners, as parents, as people living in the same household together. And as at work, wasn't easy, but we very intentionally built the life that we wanted to live together. And the biggest challenges for that are that there just aren't enough hours in the day. And there is so much mental load that exists in trying to run a household, right? So like so many of our, societal constructs are built off of the idea that one person goes to work for 40 hours a week and collects a paycheck, and the other stays home and raises the kids and cooks and cleans and does everything else in the household. And I kept seeing this in my own life and in the lives of my friends, my coworkers, where, I said there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to kind of think about the mental load. And it doesn't have to be, I think a lot of what you see on mental load on social media and various places is like, well, the men just have to step up. Like, yes, I acknowledge all of the different societal, relational, gender-based constructs that affect the mental load. And it felt really limiting for me to think that, is there nothing that parents can do to help ourselves? So that's where, I knew I wanted to start a business. I was really starting to think like, hey, this is the space I want to be in. Fast forward to having kids. So I had my first baby in April 2020, where, he had always, being the proactive, intentional people we discussed like, we're very lucky to have some resources to spend on like meal preparation and extra house cleaning and night nannies if heaven forbid our baby doesn't sleep well. When I gave birth in a hospital room filled with a bunch of people with masks, they wanted me to wear a mask, and I was like, I'm not doing that. And came home and had no help with a baby that didn't sleep. And so that's really the environment, I guess, that some of the pieces that I now have in my business really came to play, is that, in the pandemic, the only thing we had was like, how do you optimize the systems that are running our household so that we can do more with less? And so that's some of the framework that I bring to Bright Violet Home, where I kind of say, how do you take what you're really strong at in your professional life and turn it into the skills and strengths that allow you to discover how you can uniquely lead your home in a way that really flows for you?
So Leslie, there are so many things I want to dig into, but I want to actually start with one of the last things you just said. And you use the phrase more with less, which is a little triggering for me as someone who's worked in tech, because as we've seen over the last few years, there's been a lot of downsizing in the tech world. And the reality is that the workload doesn't get, it just gets piled onto somebody else, right? And so more with less really is, in the tech space, a recipe for burnout and disaster. But I'm curious, because let's be honest, there's a reason the phrase exists. And we're all trying to optimize and make our lives easier and do more with less. So talk to me a little bit about how you see that concept working for personal lives, because I want to assume that it means something different than the sort of triggering emotions I get when you say the phrase.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you calling that out, because I recognize that the lens that I'm looking through it is a lens that is not taking into account that. And I've experienced that, right? And been through, places where if you go all the way back to the growth of 30, 40, 50%, oftentimes companies, for better or for worse, they say to grow more, we have to do more. And that is a belief that both at work and in our homes, I just fundamentally reject. I think that the places that I've been in tech in particular are ones that really double down on, here are the things that are most important for our users and for our paying customers, and how do we make these things even better so that we drive the type of growth that we're really looking for, while not just adding on to, in tech, we talk a lot about feature creep, right? Feature creep happens because well-intentioned companies and well-intentioned product managers say that to support more people using our platform, they need more. And, if you look at some of the most successful companies, Apple comes to mind, what they really focus on is how do they make the experiences that they're creating really quality. So, long-winded way to come back to the home. When I really think about the home, I think that especially working parents today are told, whether explicitly or implicitly, that they should be running their homes in a certain way. They look at Instagram and Pinterest with the color-coded children's books on their shelves and the perfectly arranged aesthetic playrooms, and they think that they need to have all of that to be good parents. And a huge portion of the work that I do with my audience and my clients is really saying, what is it that you value in the home, and how do we give you more of that? So I'll actually give you an example from my own life, which is I care a lot about the food my family eats. We're all huge foodies, and I'm really lucky that my kids try lots of different foods. For a while, my son's favorite food was beets, and I was like, okay, we'll eat a lot of beets. That's a piece that's incredibly important to me. I spend a good portion of my mental energy thinking about meals. My house is actually messy compared to Instagram and Pinterest aesthetic, right? You would walk into my home at any given time and I've got piles of paper and the truck pile, because boys like trucks, and there's just a corner of our living room that's a bunch of trucks. And that is just not an area that I'm particularly interested in optimizing in my home. And so those choices, just like we're making in the workplace around what are the experiences that we're going to optimize in our home and why, are really, really important decisions, because then it drives all the things that you're just not going to care about, that you're going to let go of. And that letting go of is really, really, really hard.
What I think is also really striking, and so this is not about the sort of doing less with more, but still with these concepts that we see in the corporate space. And so I'm going to get a little philosophical here, Leslie, but when you think about the frameworks that exist in a corporate space, they are very much rooted in what I'll loosely call patriarchal thinking. And I know that one of your main audiences are high achieving women. There's a good chance that as an executive, I would have been an ideal client for you. And to your point, I spent so much mental load at work that when work was over, I had no mental capacity left really for home related topics. And, I've gone through great lengths to build minimalism and systems in my home. And during the pandemic, some of my family was a little fearful of me because having systems and having them go the way they're supposed to, it was an area of control for me during the pandemic when it felt like everything else was out of control. And so, people were afraid to move things in the pantry because they were like, mom's going to freak out, because she's got it all decanted, organized, all of the breads are in a bin, all of the nuts and crackers are in a bin, everything was just systematized. And so, it's those things can be triggering for me, if people don't follow the systems. And I am giving a big peek behind the curtain. I'm actually what's interesting is I'm much more sensitive about things not being done the way I want them at home than I am in the workplace. I have a greater level of empathy in my workspaces for the fact that people all are learning at different paces and coming from different backgrounds and sometimes need different types of help or resources or guidance or instructions or whatever it is, right? I just have a much greater level of empathy in the workplace. I do set the bar high, but I do that with a strong level of empathy. But at home, that empathy is much lower. And I don't know if it's because I give it all away during the day or if I just set the bar even higher because I'm just you're my family. These are my systems and you live these systems, so you should just know them, right? To the pantry, nothing is more aggravating than walking in the pantry and everything just looks like chaos. And you're just like, why can't you put the boxes in the trash? Why can't you put the crackers with the crackers and the bread with the bread and like everything has a place. Just put it where it goes. It's really easy. So I digress a little bit, but I guess what I'm trying to get at though is like, as a high achieving executive woman in the tech world who was corporate masking, working in male dominated industries, high achieving, setting the bar really high, all of these things, I'm existing in a very patriarchal system. And now you're telling me, Leslie, that I could have applied the patriarchal systems to my home systems and been successful. So you see where I'm going a little bit here. So what I really want to sort of philosophically discuss after a very like word salad explanation is this sort of like murkiness of patriarchal systems and matriarchal systems. Because as you said, most of when we think about like women, especially like women, gender roles, all of these things, most of those systems are, I don't know, the trend most recently that comes to mind is like the trad wife.
Yeah.
Right. And so yep. I just like, that's so in opposition to the idea of like a boss bitch, like I'm a boss bitch, I'm a CEO versus I'm a trad wife and I'm sweet and I take care of my kids and we bake all of the time and my house is perfect. And like, like they're very sort of in opposition of each other. And let's be honest, neither of them are reality. They're both like a fictional story that we see on the internet.
So you're touching on a lot of different pieces that I wrestle with my people every day. There's a couple things that come to mind, and I think I'm going to take a similar word salad approach and see kind of where we go. One is that I think that, as humans, right, I won't even specify more than that. I think that it's really tempting to try to put us into, like some of the names that you were saying, like the boss bitch, the trad wife. And the reality that I've really found, especially in working with my husband on like, how do we run our homes, is that all of these pieces exist on such a spectrum, right? Is that there are moments where I can be a total boss bitch at home, right? I'm like, okay, it is 6:55. Everybody's running around like screaming banshees. Everybody get upstairs now. Like, I'm tired of it. Like, just like get upstairs. I don't hear another word until everybody is on the second floor and pajamas are being put on. There are also times where I'm like, I could spend 2 hours cooking a nice dinner and, the types of things that you kind of associate with some of the more trad wife. And I think that so much of, again, what came down to the best companies that I've worked with and the way that I want to approach my homes and the way that I encourage my clients to approach their homes is really in the space of starting with what is important to you. What do you value? And no, in companies, it can't just be a revenue target, right? It can't be like, we want to be $1 billion unicorn, right? Like that means nothing for our ability to make really tough choices about what we're going to care about and what we're not going to care about. I think the other piece that's really important about the way that I work with folks and the way that I lead teams and lead households is really around this idea of, I want people to lead their homes. I don't want them to manage their homes, right? Because when you think about the difference between management and leadership in the workplace, similar to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? It's really easy to fall into this space of a very, patriarchal command and control mindset where it's like, okay, we have a revenue goal. This is what we're going to do to get to that revenue goal. Everybody just has to listen to me and do the things that I say so that we reach that revenue goal. Contrast that with leadership, which is, I think that a lot of parents kind of give so much of their power away by saying, like, I have to manage the household in the way that everybody else is looking at managing their household. And that's part of the reason why I stopped calling it home management and started calling it home leadership, right? As home leadership is about being strategic and understanding the systems that play in your household and implicit and explicitly deciding how you want to lead your home. And that leadership, that form of leadership is countercultural, like especially in tech, right? Like so many tech leaders go into it saying like, okay, we're only optimizing towards shareholder value. We're only optimizing towards revenue. We're only optimizing, and come hell or high water, we're do that, versus like making those tough decisions that may lead to less revenue in the short term and less, growth or whatever, but doing right by the people. That's the way that I like to think about it. That being said, like there's always this tension, right? And there's always this tension between, what is the stuff that has to get done, right? The kids have to brush their teeth and get to bed. And a lot of it is just like, I like to think about things as, the days might feel a little off, but are your weeks full, right? Like, it's okay if you yell at your kids every once in a while, right? Like they're not going to be irrevocably scarred because you lost your cool. Everyone loses their cool every once in a while. And what you do, right? This is, Dr. Becky, who's a parenting influencer, talks a lot about this. The most important thing is what you do to repair that. And in patriarchal corporate arenas, we don't talk about repair. We don't talk about values, but we can choose to do that in our houses. And it's a little bit more, I guess I'm kind of evolving my thinking as we talk. It's a little bit more about like, how do you become not the CEO of your household, which is one of those buzzwords that's starting to go around again on social media. And I just hate it. Like, I'm like, there's so many things, wrong with that. But, how do you bring that like founder entrepreneur mindset to your household? That's a more supportive way of thinking about how do you as a team, grow your household together. And what do you want that to look like?
Oh, there's some really interesting, concepts buried in there, because like when I think too about like companies that are startups that are founded, and you think about those companies as they scale and they have like such strong cultures when they first start, but as they get more into like corporate mode, they lose often some of that like culture. And so not really relevant, just a sidebar thought, as you were saying, like, the difference between sort of taking that CEO corporate approach to home leadership versus more of like a startup founder, type of mentality. And so such an interesting, just like thing that we could maybe have a sidebar conversation about sometime. But I think that this is actually a really good segue, Leslie, because the one other thing I wanted to talk to you about is how are you able to identify these sort of parallels? So people are having systems that they use successfully in their professional environment, and then you're having to help them identify those systems so that they can apply them in their personal home environment. And so I'm just curious, because like I have this weird obsession with transferable skills, but not in the way that we typically think about them. Like, I love the idea that you can take a set of skills from an industry or a certain place and apply them in some novel and innovative way. And so when I talk about transferable skills, those are the ones that I get really like excited about, because I don't want to just talk about sort of the boring approach to like, I worked in healthcare and I did this skill, and this same skill I did in healthcare applies to like, I don't know, insurance or automotive or whatever it is. Like I'm not talking about those skills. I'm talking about, recently I had a guest last year who was a burlesque performer, right? And so you think about like burlesque and like confidence and all presence and all these things. And so it's like, what kinds of transferable skills come from someone who does burlesque? How would those apply to the corporate world? You know what I mean? Like those to me are like more interesting transferable skills. So now that, again, another word salad, now that I've sort of elaborated, like, can you talk to me a little bit about what some of these trends are, what some of these common transferable skills are? Really what I'd love for people listening to get out of this, Leslie, is like to self-identify that they actually have some of these transferable skills that you would then ultimately use to help them design a better home.
Yeah. 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 And I love how you set that up, because I was listening to your description. What's interesting is I actually care less in my business around transferable skills. And what I care more about is, how would I call it? Like transferable traits, transferable competencies, right? Like there's no world in which it's like, there is, where it's like, I manage things really well in spreadsheets at work, and so I'm going to bring that home. I do a fair amount of that with my clients, and it's super fun work. But when I think about, transferable traits, So going all the way back to where you started, which is like, how do I help folks identify that? A couple different ways. So with my one-on-one clients, I really spend a good amount of time figuring out with them in conversation, how do they run their home today? Because when you start from the what's working in their home today, that oftentimes illuminates how they can use those same skills in their home to other things in their home. Same thing with their work, right? Like I spent a lot of time figuring out what do they do in their day-to-day work that is mineable, interesting pieces to be able to bring home. Or of my like group program, like I'm experimenting with a few different things now. I developed an assessment that is really about identifying through a series of targeted questions, like from a list of 25 professional traits, what are your top 3 strongest? And then identifying in a similar way, what are your top 3 home areas that you really feel like need attention? And using that data to design 3-day experiments is what I call them, which is like, how do you get some quick, agile relief that can tell you like that experiment really worked or that one fell on its face, and then taking the experiments that work and creating them into habits. So the reason I like traits better than skills is that, I think a lot of us, especially as women, we have some skills that are almost just assumed of us in the home. Things like, oh, she's got all the details organized. She like never forgets anything, never misses a kid appointment. That detail orientedness is something that comes up a lot. Or, she's very adaptable. She is able to come in and, tackle any problem. All of those pieces are almost obvious, like to say it. What I get much more interested in is when I start to see the sparks of people who are really, really creative or innovative or analytical, right? Like they have this deep creative problem solving ability at work where they are able to kind of come into any situation and think of the idea for solving a tough problem that nobody else in the room is going to think of. How do I help them, to take that analytical example further, how do I help those really analytical thinkers bring home that capability in the home where so much of it is like, well, I'm supposed to do it this certain way. If I'm meal prepping, I had this conversation with somebody last week. If I'm meal prepping, that means that I have to spend a full day prepping a week's worth of meals. Like, no, it could mean that you chop an onion the night before and like that's your form of meal prepping. The innovative piece comes up a lot, right? Like I work with a lot of folks in tech who like come into it and they're the first people to use a different type of technology. They're using AI all the time at their work, and they haven't even like thought of using AI to kind of take their recipes and create a grocery list. Another one I love is folks who have these like meticulous to-do lists for work, and then at home, everything's in their head, right? Like they don't write it down. And I'm like, write your shit down. Like that's the first step. We're going to like take it, like, okay, before we do anything else, we're going to like take a second and we're going to just like write all this stuff in your brain down. And yeah, so I just like, I get really interested in these cases where, I keep coming back to this idea of skills. It's behaviors. It's like those transferable behaviors, because the behaviors that you exhibit in your work are the things that become habits. And your whole life, there's lots of habit, information and knowledge out there. But really in the end, like I actually do believe you're a sum of your habits. You're a sum of the good and bad habits or the neutral habits that allow you to run part of your life on autopilot so that you can save your brain space for, the things that you want to be thinking about. And so much of the way that we behave in the workplace indicates to us the different ways that you can create habits and behaviors at home. And that's the piece that gets really interesting to me, not necessarily like, do you have a master's degree in blah, blah, blah. I don't even know at this point.
Yeah, it's, I don't know why, as you were talking, I thought about this example, but like something I discovered about myself, right? First of all, I tend to get really heads down when it comes to like work, and to the detriment sometimes of taking care of myself. Like for example, meals. If I'm not good about planning ahead. I don't like to think about food. It's like not a decision I want to spend my brain cells on, because like I'd much rather think about like innovative things or novel things or creative things. I don't want to think about like food consumption. And so what has happened historically is then it's like I get really ravenous. I wait until I'm like starving, and then it's path of least resistance, right? And so then it's just like, well, what's in the pantry? Oh, I'm going to eat a couple of crackers because I'm so hungry. I can't even decide what to like eat because I'm just starving. And so through this process, right, years of this process, I recognized in the last couple of years that I have to stock things that are just like kind of like something to fall back on, something that doesn't require too much thinking. But the weirder thing that I discovered is I actually have to purchase and like put it away, because if I put it on the grocery list and my husband purchases it and puts it away, there's this weird sort of like out of sight, out of mind. But if I had to go to the store and get it, and I had to come home and put it away or prep it or whatever, then I'm much more likely than when I get hungry to remember that that item is available. I cannot speak to why that is. For what it's worth, I hate going to the grocery store. I wish I could just give my husband a list, but there's some sort of like, I have some sort of weird mental block that if I don't purchase and put away the food, then it just doesn't exist. Like it's not here, even though it might very much be here. But the problem is I can't plan ahead, right? So whatever that mental mechanism, that mental process is that says, okay, I'm going to go downstairs and eat some lunch and this is what I'm going to have. That process is smoother when I have done the shopping versus if I have to just go downstairs and figure out like what's available to me. It starts to, I think it has something to do with decision fatigue. But like that's how it has played out for me. And so, I mean, I'm in a position now where I have more time. For example, I do typically most days take a real lunch. Like I sit, away from my desk, I eat food. When I worked in corporate, I did not hardly ever do that. I sat through many a meeting while scarfing down some like random bowl of or plate of something, so it's a healthier situation, but it also took years of sort of analysis to determine that like I just behave differently when I have certain control mechanisms in place.
Yeah, and I mean this is a place that I get really passionate about, right? So I'm just going to like run with it. So what you said around like I have this weird, thing that I do. So many of us as women are, I hate to say it, programmed to say the things that work for us but that might not work for other people are somehow weird or different or, unacceptable. And yet the whole reason that I started this business was that I believe that it's not just so many people in the space are trying to create another app, another to-do list system. If I have to see one more app, and I'm sure that those folks that are working on it, like there's some nugget there, but your home leadership challenge is not going to be solved by a single app. It's not going to be solved by a paper planner. It's not going to be solved by like some Pinterest influencer, post that is going to suddenly solve all of your, home challenges. What does solve it for women is looking at those weird things, right? For you, it's, I have to physically touch the prepared food that I bring into my house because then I know that it's there and I will eat it. For me, it's, I have to have piles of things around. Like I actually go crazy if there's too much order in my house, where everybody else in the influencer space would say like, no, that's not acceptable. You have to Marie Kondo everything. And I'm like, oh my God, it makes me so mad. And what you described is what I want to do for people is give them a system to discover the weirdness that really works for them, right? Because you described it. The three pillars of home leadership, right, are like systems design. You looked at what are the systems that I need to be able to feed myself. Okay, let me run an experiment. Agile methodology. How do I run an experiment that lets me get closer or further? Either is fine as long as you learn, to understanding how I need, in my unique, weird, one-of-a-kind way, run my home. And then you made it a habit, right? You brought in that behavioral science to say, like, all right, this is a weird thing that works for me. I'm just going to be the person who buys the prepared food because I'm not going to cook for myself in the middle of the day, and I'm going to bring it home from the grocery store. I'm going to touch it and I'm going to put it away. Like, that's a habit, and that's uniquely you, and that's how you've chosen to create these systems for yourself. And it's something that I think a lot of parents feel disempowered to do. And that's what I want to change. That's what I want to change in the world. And I'm so excited to get the opportunity to start to change it.
Well, I have to say, we've had such a full circle conversation, but we are coming to the end of the show, Leslie. And I love to wrap every episode by saying, if someone said this episode was way too long, I did not listen to it. What is one thing, one message, one takeaway that you'd want them to take from this conversation?
I would say the most important thing in work and at home you can do for yourselves, your teams, and your families is to really lean into what is important to you, even if it's weird, even if it feels countercultural, even if it feels like something that nobody else in the world would do. Those are the things to really pay attention to, because that's how you develop your unique leadership, workplace, home style.
I love that, Leslie. You're really talking about authenticity and alignment with one's values. And so, I mean, those are certainly subjects that come up on the show a lot, and certainly something that I can sort of rally behind. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. We went in so many different directions and it kept coming back to the same circle. So I loved it. Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.